your table, just shake hands, introduce yourselves, just to get to get everyone involved.
I mean, we've already done that.
I think we're ahead of the game, so.
Yeah, I think we're good. I loved the forced social interaction component.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you. Did you get some? Okay,
Yeah.
Good.
Oh, no, perfect.
I guess they don't want paper cups on stage. Thanks, Kat.
Thank you. It's funny, I don't think these chairs are made for short folks. I'm like, this is as far back as I can go. So
Okay, I think
I'll
that's
be working
enough.
on my posture today.
These chairs are weird, I was telling them. It's like,
I wanted you to introduce yourselves to each other, not get into full-on sales pitches. Okay, if you can take your seats again, please. So my name's Louis Yakumi. I'm the publisher of the Automotive Logistics Group, who are publishers of Automotive Logistics and Finished Vehicle Logistics magazines, organizers of the Automotive Logistics Global Conference that are held in Europe, China, Mexico, UK, Brazil, Russia, India, and of course the great United States of America. And whilst I'm introducing myself, you might also notice either last night, this morning, over the next 2 days, that Christopher Ludwig isn't at the conference this year. We were getting too much good feedback of what a good moderator he was, so I thought, that's it, he's got to go. But seriously, Christopher's had a very well-deserved promotion within our group. He's now the content editor for the whole Ultima Media group, but you will see him again at our conferences, and he's actually currently not so far away. He's in Silicon Valley, building contacts and meeting people who will no doubt be the disruptors of our industry in the future. And I'm also very pleased to introduce his replacement as editor of Automotive Logistics Group, that includes Automotive Logistics Magazine and, of course, Finished Vehicle Logistics Magazine, Joanne Perry. Joanne, if you can just make yourself known. Thank you. Very British, very Queen-like, I think, the way she waved there. Joe's here for the 2 days, so please introduce yourselves and share any ideas that you might have for our magazines. This great Finished Vehicle Logistics group also understands the best way to network and to do business, and that's by having a little bit of fun. At our conferences around the world, you can imagine, we sometimes give themes to the conferences. I think about 2 years ago, we made it the fun conferences. Then we did the collaboration conferences and the getting to know each other conferences. Well, I've given up on Finished Vehicle Logistics North America, because whatever I call it, it's always going to be the fun conference, I guess. And I think the ones who are leading this are our sponsors. Tonight, Jack Cooper are hosting an amazing gala dinner, which is going to have great fun food as well as some games and prizes. So make sure you're here for that. It started yesterday with the whale and dolphin watching and the golf day, which was hosted by our gold sponsors, KHS. I was a bit surprised that I wasn't allowed to go on the whale watching, apparently in case I got harpooned. I'm not quite sure what they meant by that. And what a fantastic cocktail reception last night, hosted by Accelerated Services. As we knew, as soon as they signed on to be the cocktail sponsors, we knew it was going to be a party, and it really was, so thank you to Accelerated for last night. There's also a truck and equipment show across the road from the hotel. If you look out from across, you see it, that's what it looks like there. There's going to be, different trucks and shows there that you could go to see what the trucks are like, the new technology that's out there. And also at the end of the conference, after the final session, if you'd like to join us over there for some snacks, some hot dogs and donuts. So that's another addition to the conference. We're also very proud that Dentology are our water sponsors this year, as they made our water sponsorship very environmentally friendly. We've used special water dispensers to cut down on the water bottles that we all throw away and cause so much harm. And a tree's also been planted on behalf of the finished vehicle logistics industry. So we've got a special tree called Finished Vehicle Logistics. And it's good to see that now so many dogs will now be able to do to finished vehicle logistics, as so many others have done to us over the years. Our new sponsor, Driver, have laid on great coffee breaks as well to keep us refreshed throughout the 2 days. So don't forget to visit the stands of all our sponsors. As I said, our premier sponsor, Jack Cooper, our gold sponsors, Accelerated Services, CFR Rinkins, Confezione Andrea, Dentology, Driver, ICL, Inform, KHS, Metrogistics, Nationwide, PAT, Masney Auto Transport, Proact International, and US Auto Logistics, and our silver sponsors, Crown Auto Transport and Logistics, JMN, and United Road. You'll also see in your conference bags that there should be a silver coin in your bags. That's for a prize draw. So if you collect the coin, take it to the Dentology stand where you'll be allocated a number and go into a prize draw for some fantastic prizes there. So make sure you don't miss any of this fun, any of the whole conference really, by making sure you download the app. So to get you started, maybe there's free Wi-Fi, which is sponsored by Proact International. The network name is FVL 2018, and the password is Proact18. And you can see details in your little slips here about how to download the app, including details of the password and how to download the app from Google Play and the Apple iStore. With the app, you'll be able to see the whole schedule, send and receive direct messages to and from other attendees, read more about the speakers and sponsors, and very importantly, be part of the voting and polling that we'll be doing throughout the conference. You can ask questions that the moderators can see, so we can, ask out loud, and also give feedback on the whole conference. So make sure you download the app. It's simple to do. It's a simple to use app. It has to be. If I can use it, we have to make it idiot-proof. And it really is an important part of the whole event. So make sure you don't miss this important element to the conference. The other thing we've got, which we've done before, in front of you, you'll see red and green cards. These are for snap polls that you will be doing throughout the conference, just to get quick feedback on simple yes or no answers throughout any of the sessions and throughout the day. So maybe we can start off with this. So maybe if you get your red and green cards, and I'll ask a question. And the question is going to be, who's looking forward to buying an autonomous vehicle? So if you can put your cards up, red for no, green for yes. But it would be interesting to see who's actually looking forward to buying an autonomous vehicle. So it's an interesting split, or it is for me because I'm colorblind, so all look the same. No, it was about 50-50. So it's interesting, there isn't this great desire at this stage to buy autonomous cars. But on the other hand, maybe I'm asking the wrong audience. Because if there are autonomous cars and they start delivering themselves, maybe that's why you're not so keen on autonomous cars. But what we'd like to do now is we've got for this first session of the conference, something that's looking forward to how the infrastructure around us, how smart cities are going to develop. We'll be looking at how logistics is going to develop. What will logistics look like in a few years' time? And then we're going to be looking at current trends, future trends on forecasts on sales and production, and also some other views and ideas on mobility. So this is a great opportunity to learn the future of the world around us, so that we can then talk over the 2 days what that means for us and what that means for your industry. So I'd like to welcome the first speaker of the day for Finished Vehicle Logistics 2018, Joshua Shank, the Chief Innovation Officer for Los Angeles Metropolitan Transportation Authority. Thank you, Joshua.
Thanks.
So, you may be familiar with Los Angeles. It's a little town up the road, PCH, not too far from here. And Los Angeles County is the largest county in the country. It is larger than 42 states. We have about 11 million people. we also have a tremendous mobility problem. I'm going to talk about how we define that problem and then how we're attacking it. So the problem is that mobility in Los Angeles County is not working. We are the transportation provider for LA County, which means that we provide buses and trains in operation, carrying 1.3 million people a day, but also that we are responsible for the planning and building of infrastructure in LA County, and in fact that we fund all 88 cities in LA County that are building their infrastructure. So it's a big problem that we are supposed to address. The thesis that we have about how we address this is probably very different than how you think about mobility. Because our thesis is that we have to reduce the number of people driving alone in vehicles. There's simply not enough road space from a geometric standpoint, and we're not going to be able to build enough to accommodate demand. We already have more demand than we can possibly accommodate for single occupancy vehicle use, so things need to change. And this is what we're doing. We're going to set a course, we're going to accelerate projects, we're going to try new stuff. That's why my boss created the Office of Extraordinary Innovation, which sounds like something out of Harry Potter, but is actually an opportunity for us to take on a very, very big problem with new and exciting approaches. So let's start with autonomous vehicles, because this is the question I get posed to me most often, and because I know that that's something of interest to this audience. I often get asked about autonomous vehicles because people think that a chief innovation officer sits in a room and comes up with really cool new technology ideas and figures out how we're going to implement them. It's actually not what I do. I'm accountable for results tomorrow for bringing new ideas to Metro, and I'll talk more about some of those. But let's talk about autonomous vehicles, because I think that the distinction between the levels of autonomy is pretty critical from a public policy perspective. And when you think about what we achieve in level 4 and 5 versus the other levels, for me, as a public policy person who's thinking about policy outcomes, that distinction is really important. And I ask some questions about these things. Why, if we are going to have level 4 and 5 autonomous vehicles, do we not have level 4 and 5 autonomous planes? And you could say, well, we do have them. Yes, the technology is there, but you may notice that when you're flying next time that there are 2 pilots in the front, and the reason they're there is that things can go wrong, and it would be a horrible disaster if they did. And they're there, and they're trained to take over in an emergency. I have not yet been given compelling evidence that this will be different for vehicles. I'm willing to be convinced otherwise, but I don't understand why it would be different for vehicles. Question number 2, what makes this technology different? There are lots of examples of failed transportation initiatives. You may be familiar with some of these. The PRT is one of my most favorite ones. People often come up to me and say, let's do PRT in Los Angeles. You can't do PRT in anywhere that has an existing built infrastructure, because you have to find a right-of-way for it. And that's very difficult and expensive. Now, autonomous vehicles face other problems, but the point is that there's lots of technology ideas that have died out there in transportation, because transportation uses public right-of-way and has to deal with public policy and has to deal with government. All those things make it way more complicated than, say, bringing in the iPhone. 3, from an economic perspective, why aren't people sharing more right now? A lot of times people say, well, the autonomous future is going to be sharing of vehicles. We just asked the question, how many people would purchase an autonomous vehicle? The question I would ask right now is, how many people are sharing vehicles? Because not very many people are, if you look at the data. If you look at the number of cars that have come to LA County in the last decade, we've gotten 2.1 million new cars to Los Angeles County, and only 2.3 million people. So people are still buying cars, and they're not looking to share, even though the economic incentives are there right now for them to share. If you do the math, most people in Los Angeles County could live by sharing vehicles and giving up their car and using public transportation and live a very good life and save a lot of money, but they don't do it because people like owning cars. 4, why do we care about getting to level 4 or 5? The main objective from a policy standpoint, again, I understand why some people might care about it because they're going to make money off of it, but I don't care about that. What we care about is public policy objectives, and therefore the number 1 objective we care about when it comes to automotive policy is too many people are getting killed. And so if we want to focus on anything, it's what autonomous features can we bring to bear that will reduce vehicle fatalities. and accidents. Those things are happening at a way higher level than is acceptable. And so all of our energy should be focused from a public policy standpoint on trying to bring autonomous features that will reduce fatalities, not on making sure that people can look at their phones while they're driving and don't have to pay attention, which seems to me to be a lot less important. And finally, there is this question about whether autonomous vehicles will actually ever be able to fully handle the urban environment in a real substantial way. Because the urban environment is way more complicated than people think. And yes, I know that there are autonomous vehicles operating right now without drivers in urban environments, but that is very different from being able to do that at all times and doing it in all places and doing it very fast, which is what's critical for transportation, is being able to achieve that level of speed and flexibility, because people need to count on it. So if it's only available in certain places at certain times, people won't adopt it en masse. So that's what I have to do to get you riled up about our perspective on autonomous vehicles to start. Now let me tell you about some of the things we are doing right now that we can actually do, because I haven't been able to do anything on the autonomous space, but I have been able to do other things that are really exciting and innovative. And I'm going to talk to you about it by some of the quotations I've heard while at LA Metro. This is my favorite one. This is a really innovative idea, but we can't do it because it's never been done before. It's a classic response to something when you bring it to people, right? They're scared. They're scared of taking the risk. They're scared of moving forward with something new. But because we are the Office of Extraordinary Innovation, and we've been empowered by the CEO, to whom I report directly, to create new innovations, they don't have a choice. They're going to do it. And that's what we've been doing. Here's an exciting thing that we're doing that it does revolve around a lot of the work that you guys do. This is our microtransit pilot. For those who aren't familiar with microtransit, it's an on-demand service that pools rides in urban areas. There are many private microtransit providers that have failed. There are many public-private partnerships with microtransit that have failed. We're going to try again. And we're going to try again with a different model that will be the largest microtransit pilot program in the country when it launches. It's currently in the blackout period. We are going to be selecting a private sector partner soon. I think the key point here is that we're trying to improve mobility for people both who are currently using public transit. There are lots of people taking buses in Los Angeles County who are transferring and waiting 20 minutes between transfers, and it takes them an hour and a half to get where they're going. This could offer a point-to-point service. But we're also trying to help more people get to and from our transit stations as we expand our infrastructure. If we improve our service, more people will use it, and we can't afford that. That's a reaction I get a lot. Public transit, as you probably know, is a money-losing operation. We collect about, if we're on a good day, about 20% of our operating costs in the fare box. So people are afraid that if we provide a better service, then more people are going to use it, and then we're not going to have enough money. And we try to blow right past that as well. Here's a partnership we're offering. It's a great example. We're going to be working with a transportation network company called Via, which is similar to Uber or Lyft, except they only do shared rides. And we're going to test whether if we open up that service to more people, will that increase the number of people riding public transportation? Because currently those services, you may or may not be aware, are not accessible to all people. If you do not have a smartphone, if you do not have a bank account, if you are disabled, or if you are low income, you cannot use transportation network companies at the moment. So this is a transportation network company that will be accessible to all those groups who happen to be our core customers. And we're going to see what happens when at 3 of our stations, within a radius about 3 miles from those stations, we allow everybody to use these services. Will that increase the number of people coming? And what's interesting about this is when we go to our operations people who run our buses and say, okay, we want to do it here, they say, well, don't do it there because then you're going to take people off of our buses. To which I say, if we're offering people a better service, why wouldn't that be a good thing? And that goes back to the issue of, well, it's going to cost more money. We could have thought of that on our own. You get this a lot as an innovation person because you bring people ideas that in retrospect seem obvious, and they say, oh yeah, we're going to do that. That was going to happen. Well, you could have thought it on your own, but I think of it as like abstract art, right? I mean, you could have done a Jackson Pollock, but you didn't. He did it. And in the same way, somebody else has come up with an idea. And that's why we have this unsolicited proposal policy, which has been a very exciting endeavor. In 2016, we started it. We opened our doors and said, anyone with an idea from the private sector can tell us what it is. We'll give you a response. And we will allow the idea that we don't know best what we're doing, that in fact the private sector is better at innovating, the private sector has the better ideas. We should be listening and working with them. And in fact, what happened as a result of that is that we've received over 100 proposals for new ideas. Many of them aren't very good, but a lot of them are. And our job is to sort through them and figure out which ones might work for us and for our private partner. We've gotten, of these 100 proposals, most of them are declined. But the fact that we've gotten so many and that the pipeline keeps coming makes them successful. This gives you a sense of what kind of categories we're getting. A lot of them are for major capital projects, for private financing for major capital projects that can help us accelerate our infrastructure provision. But a whole bunch are in the technology and mobility services space. So as a result of these unsolicited proposals, we've advanced 3 mega projects to a further public-private partnership type phase. As you may know, in November 2016, in addition to electing Donald Trump as president, we also passed a ballot measure in the state of California. And that was a day for Los Angeles County that was very conflicting. But what we did was we raised, with 71% of the vote, a half-cent sales tax indefinitely to build infrastructure and tackle the mobility problem. We're going to be building out our transportation system and particularly our public rail network dramatically. But it's going to take a long time because we're waiting for the cash flow to come in from the sales tax. So these projects, the private sector said to us, well, we can accelerate these projects with private financing and operations and maintenance. We're going to get these done much faster. And we're going to get them done with greater accountability, and you're going to be able to transfer some of the risk to the private sector. And that's exactly what we're doing. Just to kind of go through what these look like, this is a line that's going to go actually all the way to the Orange County border from downtown Los Angeles, the West Santa Ana Branch Corridor. Through a part of LA that is dramatically underserved by public transit, where there are very low-income people who can definitely use and will use this service, very high projected ridership. Here's another one. If you've ever driven on the 405 at all, you know that it is a very unpleasant experience. Now there will be an alternative to that, hopefully, as we think about building through the Santa Monica Mountains, connecting the valley to the west side with a project development agreement that will allow the private sector to come in early in the process and innovate and figure out how to solve this problem. And here's the one that I did get the response to, where someone said, well, we could have thought of that on our own. We're building a network of express lanes, hot lanes, toll lanes throughout LA County. And our plan was to build them over 40 years. Well, Goldman Sachs came in and said, well, instead of building them over 40 years, just build the ones that produce the most revenue first and then use that revenue to build the next one, which seems very obvious in retrospect. But when we said it to our folks who were doing this, what do you think of this idea? They said, yes, we were going to do that. I said, great, that's a win. We'll take it. There are many other innovation pilot programs that have come out of this. I'm not going to go through all of these, but just to give you a sense of the different really cool ideas that have come out of the unsolicited proposal process. Here's another quote that I've heard: we shouldn't give our customers more options that will confuse them. I've never understood this line of thinking, but we get it a lot, that customers don't want options, they want just one thing that they know and they'll be fine. Well, that's very much a public transit perspective on things. But we disagree. And that's why we're giving people an option with tolling. We're working on how people can pay for their tolls using a mobile phone. We're going to be testing that relatively soon with an RFP that's coming out to figure out whether, if we give people the option, will they use their phone instead of a transponder to pay for tolls? Seems like a worthwhile test. One other proposal we received said, well, you're giving your customers bad information about when the next bus is arriving. And we agree, we were giving them bad information. And they said, well, it's very simple to solve that. You slap this GPS on every bus, and then we've got a better algorithm that will predict bus arrival. We tested it, they were right, now we're doing it. Here's an easy and simple concept. Some people bike to our stations. It is Southern California, it is beautiful weather, it's often flat. You can bike to your stations, but there's nowhere to put the bike, or it's difficult or cumbersome to use one of our bike lockers. This is an easier one. You walk up, you use your tap card, which is the same way you pay for our transit system, and you unlock it, and then you put it in your bike, and you lock it again, and then it's there for you when you come back. Pretty simple concept. You would think that these types of things would be easy. You just come in and someone says, oh, this is our idea, and you do it. It doesn't actually work that way. There's always resistance to anything you're trying to do that's new, but we're getting this done. This is one of my favorite quotes. This is a waste of time and money. That's what Bob told me. You know, a lot of times I say to people, okay, it's great that you don't like this idea, but what data do you have to demonstrate that, right? Because anyone can not like something and have a personal gut reaction, but in the real world, we have to make decisions based on actual data. And that's what bothered me about this quote, as I said to him, what did Bob look at that told him that this would be a waste of time and money? That's what I care about. Here's an example of, this is actually the one unsolicited proposal we got from someone within the agency, which is odd, right? That someone within the agency had an idea that we could do, that we weren't doing, shows you how much culture change we have to drive in order to succeed. He said, look, we've got this busway, the Orange Line busway in Los Angeles, which operates on its own right-of-way. And right now, bus drivers are speeding up and then slowing down because they have to stop at red lights. Even though the lights are timed for them, they don't know what speed to drive. So why don't we just put a little iPad in the driver's seat, the driver's dashboard, tells them what speed to drive, and they'll make every light. Very simple, right? And in fact, it is not proving to be simple largely because of other government entities that we have to work with in order to make it happen. But it was an idea that came from within the agency that had not percolated to the top until we created an innovation office where this guy felt like it could go somewhere. This is actually what Bob didn't like. Drone-based inspection, system inspection. This is, where we were talking about unmanned aircraft earlier. Unmanned aircraft without people in them are actually very easy to use and very popular, and they can potentially allow us to inspect our facilities and tracks much more rapidly. Right now, you may or may not know, a person walks our track. We have over 90 miles of track, so it's a lot of walking to do that, and a drone can do that much more efficiently. When we went to say to the operations, can we test this? They said, Bob said it was a waste of time and money, so we didn't do it. We actually had to find a different department, facilities, to test it. We tested it, and now we're moving forward with the drone system. So what does all this mean? What we're trying to do is create a culture of innovation within a large public agency, and that takes time. I've been there 2 years. A little over 2 years, and my boss has been there a little over 2 years. And we came to an agency that had largely been tasked with everything, but unable to accomplish a lot of things. Because every transportation problem in Los Angeles gets thrown at LA Metro, because we're the biggest agency and we have the most resources. But we're not able to tackle them. And the reason we're not able to tackle them is that the average person in the average public agency is going about doing their job to minimize risk, not to maximize outcomes. And our role at LA Metro has been to say, no, we're going to think about this differently. Instead of telling me why we can't do this idea, let's look at what are the costs and benefits of doing this idea. What would it cost? What would it take to get this thing through? And is it worth it? That's how you have to think about it. Instead of thinking about what's going to happen if you fail, if you try this and it doesn't work, let's think about, well, what's going to happen if you fail, and how do we learn from that so that we can do it better next time? A lot of the problem comes down to that people who take risks are not rewarded in public agencies, and people who think critically, who try to tackle a problem by going through it methodically and figuring out how to deal with it, are not rewarded in public agencies. And what we've done by creating this innovation office is try to switch that all around. Try to make people think about the outcomes that they care about for mobility and for LA County, and to think about how we can work with the private sector to accomplish those outcomes more efficiently. So that's what we're doing in Los Angeles. I look forward to talking to all of you later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joshua. An interesting, good start to the conference there, encouraging thinking differently and how to think positively, be proactive about change. So thank you very much. Next up, to hear a little bit more about, more specifically, our industry, I guess, I'd like to welcome to the podium Sarah Amico, the chairman of Jack Cooper Holdings. Thank you, Sarah.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Louie, and thank you to the Finished Vehicle Logistics Conference for having me this year. This morning, we're going to talk about broad buckets of the drivers and trends that are shaping our industry. And I think if I had to boil it down to one simple message for this group, it would be that we're living in very dynamic times. Changes are evolving very quickly, both on the technological side and on the regulatory and governmental side in which we all operate. And I think, last but not least, we'll cover what that means for 21st century partnerships between the OEMs and their carriers and suppliers, particularly with respect to the supply chain. So if we look here, let's start with the three big buckets. Again, I think we can look at what is making this environment so dynamic today in essentially three groups. Technological revolution, really more than evolution, certainly a changing and uncertain regulatory and governmental context environment, and then last but not least, partnerships between the carriers and the OEMs. So let's talk about for a minute, what does the future look like as an autonomous, electrified, connected, and shared ownership of vehicles takes hold? One of the things that I would say is that these are all changes that are driving us to have a tremendous amount of uncertainty in terms of both timeline and the impact on consumer behavior. So this is part of what creates essentially volatility in how we manage what are pretty tightly knit supply chains, particularly for those of us on the finished vehicle logistics delivery side. In terms of timeline for autonomous vehicles, I think Josh did a phenomenal job of explaining why so many of us are skeptical that the level 4 and 5 autonomous vehicle revolution is coming in the very near term. As a carrier, one thing we're really focused on in the autonomous area is how the sort of level 3 and below driver assist features can make our roads safer. So as a parent, not just as an executive and a business owner, but as a parent, it's very reassuring to me that some of these features will continue to make the roads safer for the cars and the families with whom we share them. And also, as a business owner, I have to say, this is really reassuring for me from the perspective of the safety of our drivers. You know, we've got 2,000 trips approximately a day, about 2,000 drivers on the road, and one of the things that we are trying to implement as a company and as a culture is what we call Project Zero, getting down to zero accidents, getting the best safety track record in the industry. And part of that cultural shift for us is going to come in really truly communicating to our drivers that the most important stop of the day that they will make is their home. So I'm very encouraged by the promise of autonomous vehicles. I'm a little bit skeptical that this will revolutionize sort of mass transit in the consumer side, not in the public transit authority side, in the near future. And I think part of that is because we do have to develop the technology in a way that's more consistent in various weather conditions. So I know there was a great write-up in the New York Times this weekend, for example, about autonomous heavy trucks now on the roads and highways in Arizona. But again, much like the airline analogy that Josh used for us, they are driving with drivers in the cab in the event that they're needed, or in the event of the unexpected. These technologies will evolve over time, but for the time being, I think the analogy I would use for airplanes, Josh, is that autopilot right now or autonomous vehicles can't pull a Sully. They're not going to land on the Hudson. And so there is still that room for human judgment to come into play when the unexpected inevitably happens. In terms of electrification, connected cars, shared ownership, let's tackle electrification. I think that's something that we're going to see more and more of. We're seeing that certainly in the regulatory environments of various countries around the world that are now essentially setting expiration dates for internal combustion engines. I think we're seeing it in the product slates that are being announced by the OEMs. I think this is an exciting future, but it also begs a couple of questions around infrastructure for charging and how we manage that transition over time. In the connected car space, my biggest concern right now, and I think you'll hear a little bit more about this in a panel later from our Jack Cooper logistics team, but is privacy. You know, the idea of personally identifiable information and the regulatory environment that can govern our responsibility as an industry, whether that's for the rental car agencies, for the finished vehicle logistics providers, or certainly for the OEMs. You know, as you sync your phone with a car, you're downloading a tremendous amount of information about you and potentially your family, where your kids go to school, where you live, where you work, the text messages you've sent, who you call on a regular basis, and when the last time you spoke to them was. A lot of that information continues to reside in the vehicle long after you've rented that. And that's something that I think we're going to have to take a lot more seriously as an industry. And the higher the number of players that are touching in the supply chain that vehicle or potentially having access to that information, the greater the risk. So I think in terms of longer term horizon over the next few years, I would look to see much more governmental regulation on that front. But at the same time, it certainly enables us to have opportunity to interact with our vehicles in a much more meaningful way to the individual. In terms of shared ownership, you know, it's interesting, much like autonomous vehicles, I don't think this will be evenly developed throughout the country. I think we're going to have a large split between urban, suburban, and rural areas. As somebody who grew up in rural Southwest Missouri, has lived in New York and LA, and now resides in suburban Atlanta, I can say that the transportation models that work in those areas vary dramatically. So what I would look to see is more of a foothold in the urban areas for autonomous vehicles, mass transit that becomes reliant eventually on autonomous technology, and certainly shared ownership models. If you look at utilization of vehicles, I think Morgan Stanley's analyst typically estimates that it's about 6% at most vehicle utilization. And in the portfolio of assets we'll buy in our lifetime, that's actually tremendously underutilized assets. So I do expect, particularly in urban areas or in socioeconomic groups that really struggle to have full asset ownership on vehicles, that we'll see a lot more of the shared ownership taking hold in the future. And that certainly will have implications for the finished vehicle logistics supply chain. Now, one of the things that I would say is I don't necessarily believe that will mean lower sales. So as they build these vehicles that are more designed for shared ownership, they're going to be a different kind of vehicle, a much more utilitarian feel. And my suspicion is that as the utilization of the asset goes up, so will the turnover. So in effect, you could be burning through more of the VINs and driving a very different kind of sales. So I'm I'm an optimist, and we'll talk about that later, but I believe that these dynamic opportunities actually will create an environment in which innovation can take hold in a way that we haven't seen potentially in a generation. One of the other things that I'm super excited about, and again, I'm sure we're going to be hearing many, many more speakers touch on this topic, big data. You know, Jack Cooper, on an average year, touches between 3.7 and 4.1 million vehicles that we transport. That is a large data set that could be used to do any number of things to improve supply chain efficiency. So as we look at, you know, if you look at artificial intelligence as a set, you've sort of got the broader set of anything from macros to spreadsheet algorithm calculations in basic artificial intelligence. And I would argue that many of us in the logistics industry have actually been using those tools for a very long time. And certainly, again, to go back to the airplane analogy, if you look at tools like Lamasoft, we've been using these kinds of tools to reposition equipment through networks for a long time. If you look further down the road, you have sort of the deep learning space, so the idea of algorithms that over time can actually teach themselves to become more efficient. And I think the promise of that future and what it means for optimization of finished vehicle logistics networks is truly astounding. But unfortunately, like the autonomous vehicle space, I think we're much further out from that being widespread. So the interesting space for me is sort of the sweet spot in the middle, where I don't think we're quite there yet, but we're certainly on the cusp, which is machine learning. Algorithms that will be able to assist us in optimizing the position of equipment in our network, certainly drivers with respect to dynamically and changing environments of regulation and hours of service, length and weight. I think this is going to be something that we can actually utilize in the near future. And it's particularly interesting because it's sort of the double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, we talked about electrification, autonomous technology, shared ownership, some of the things that create a little bit of volatility in our market. I would argue that this is the other side of the sword. The opportunity to utilize big data and machine learning to become increasingly efficient in the supply chain is going to provide us with a way to actually harness some of that dynamic environment for our own good, using predictive analytics to overlay on the supply chain and predict potential breakdowns and bottlenecks in the finished vehicle logistics delivery supply chain. I believe right now we're at the very beginning of it, but my guess would be within 2 to 3 years, this is very much the way all of us think of doing business. It does have some challenges. Candidly, these are expensive technologies to develop. You need large data sets to make them efficient, and my concern would be that smaller carriers will have a harder time keeping up. So I think that this is something that has the potential to add a lot of efficiency to the networks and to our supply chains, but it's probably also an area where, as an industry, we're going to need to determine how to collaborate. So that's sort of the first bucket of technological advances. Let's look at the second, which is a personal favorite of mine. I think we live in an extraordinary time for governmental context and regulatory environment. If you look at particularly the issue of infrastructure, which affects every single one of us here, this is from the infrastructure report card published last year. So about 9.1% of the nation's bridges are structurally deficient. You did not mishear that. 9.1% of the bridges are structurally deficient, the ones you're driving on. 21% of the nation's highways have what are classified as poor pavement conditions, and the result of this is that 6.9 billion hours are delayed in traffic per year. So for everyone in this room, that's about 42 hours per year. Additionally, we didn't include this stat, but the average age of a bridge in the United States is greater than 40 years. So the question of whether or not we're going to have infrastructure and how we pay for that, you're going to hear a lot more about the idea of gas tax expansion over the next couple of years, I think will increasingly become a part of that governmental context in which we operate. And then, of course, you're dealing with the political environment in the United States. This administration has taken a very aggressive approach to deregulation, to cutting through what they call the red tape. But the problem is it's not a linear issue. In the event that you have in 2020 a new president elected on the left side, it is a pendulum. And so as executives in finished vehicle logistics, we need to be able to navigate in either case. The new announcement of steel and aluminum tariffs is really pretty stunning. I think the Wall Street Journal ran a piece on Saturday outlining 21 locations for foreign auto manufacturing plants that would be put at risk by these. So I do think this is something for us to keep an eye on, and it's really just a reminder to say that it matters. It matters very much, the government context in which we operate. Let's go the other way. One other thing I would say is the markets, as you all know, respond to certainty. So the complicating factor of the government environment and regulatory context in which we operate today is the lack of certainty. So not to pick on the president, but let's go through a few of his statements over the last few days. This is 9 days ago, where he's basically complaining about trade deficits with Mexico and Canada, because there's nothing that says be a good neighbor like putting this up in a tweet. This is what he says 9 days ago. 5 days ago, he praises Australia for playing ball on both military and trade relationships that he deems fair. 4 days ago, this one is a bit of a stunner. For somebody who's married to a European-born, naturalized American citizen, the European Union, wonderful countries who treat the U.S. very badly on trade. I mean, this is the wake-up tweet from the President of the United States. If they drop their horrific barriers and tariffs on U.S. products going in, we will likewise drop ours. Big deficit. If not, we tax cars, etc. Fair. And then, of course, 2 days ago, Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross speaking with representatives of the EU about eliminating the large tariffs and barriers they use against the USA. Not fair to our farmers and manufacturers. And the reality is that we're all waking up every day to see what's on this Twitter feed, to see if policy has changed, not by some deliberative process, not by some well-researched, well-managed, transparent public process that truly establishes the U.S. best interests, but we're looking to see what the president woke up and tweeted. So we've got to be able to manage a very dynamic era in terms of that governmental context as well. So, you've got the bucket of technological trends that are really advancing rapidly, but it's not a straight line. We have to be prepared for rapid acceleration of any one of those trends. In the second bucket, you've got to be able to live in the political context in which we now operate. We're enjoying a moment of deregulation, but we could just as likely be dealing with whiplash on the other side in 4 years. So what does that mean for the finished vehicle logistics carriers? We're being asked to purchase assets that have a useful life of 10 to 20 years every time you buy a tractor-trailer combination. And for many of us, it's probably on the higher side of that. But we're looking at contracts with our manufacturers that typically endure for 1 to 3 years. So in a normal environment, we've all accepted that this is the way the business works, and it makes sense. It's a reasonable risk to take. I would argue that in the environment where we have rapidly advancing technological change that won't develop in a straight line but may exponentially accelerate, and in an environment with a tremendous amount of geopolitical uncertainty and political unpredictability, this becomes an increasingly tricky proposition. And it's something that we're going to need to learn to navigate as suppliers to the automotive industry. So here's a great scene from a movie. It's too bad we're not using the red and green cards. If I said, how many of you have seen Apollo 13, I think I'd see a sea of green cards out there. They finally figured out in Apollo 13 that these are the items they have on board the ship to try to get them back to Earth. Right? They are now in full crisis mode, and it's sort of all hands on deck. They're dumping out boxes of every conceivable gadget or tool or resource that they can think of that's on the space shuttle. And these are the engineers in the movie and in the real life story who are tasked with figuring out how do you build CO2 filters that keep the astronauts breathing using what's on that table. And I would submit to you today that the environment in which we're operating in a 21st century supplier partnership between carriers and the OEMs is very much like this table. It is going to be absolutely critical that we know exactly what the tools are, exactly what we have on board, and that we're all there, we're present, and we're working in a collaborative fashion. I think those 21st century supplier partnerships need to have 3 big themes. The first is, as technology becomes a bigger and bigger driver of how we do finished vehicle logistics, we have got to be co-developing those technologies. Jack Cooper, I know in particular, is working with automotive manufacturers in our client base to look specifically at machine learning, using those large data sets, using the number of vehicles we touch a year to create predictive analytics, not just for us, but for their supply chains. I think co-developing some of these technologies is going to be absolutely critical, whether you're eliminating personally identifiable information from a vehicle in the previously owned market, or whether you're looking at gaining efficiencies in the supply chain to manage cost for the OEs. Secondly, I think regular communication. We've got to have a better and better idea of the environment in which the OEs are operating in a much more holistic fashion. The analogy here is we need to know exactly what those tools were on the table in the last slide. Imagine what would have happened if somebody had held the CO2 filter out behind their back. There's no way that that group of engineers could have solved the problem. So we've got to be in a regular line of communication where all of the cards are on the table. And the last thing is, I do think we need to start thinking about creating value outside of just delivering a vehicle from point A to B. Because the reality is, if we're just delivering a car from A to B in a certain amount of time and at a certain price point, it is too easy to become a commodity. And when you're looking at the environment we've talked about this morning, and you're looking at a 10 to 20 year asset that we're purchasing, the tractor-trailer combination, for a 1 to 3 year contract, we can't afford to become commoditized. So these are the environments in which we're operating, and I'd leave with just sort of one thought, which is the best way, in my opinion, to navigate uncertainty is to know who you are and what you value. To set stakes in the ground, not in response to events that happen, not in response to technologies that take hold, and certainly not in response to the president's Twitter feed, but to know who you are based on the values. So for Jack Cooper, we've put these 6 stakes in the ground. We've said integrity, operational excellence, responsibility, to all of our stakeholders, including the communities where we live and operate, innovation and imagination, longevity. We're a family business, and this is our 90th anniversary as a company, so no surprise that longevity would be there, but also safety and health of our employees. How do we harness the energy of this very dynamic moment in the history of finished vehicle logistics to make sure we're treating our workers in a way that gets them home as safely as possible every single time? So these are the values we're navigating by, and it's my hope that regardless of how these dynamics in our industry develop, that we'll always be able to find our footing because we know who we are. So thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate everybody being here.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Again, great presentation, giving us the thoughts of, how the industry is going to develop from the supplier side, what you have to consider, what you have to look at, and what the mindset has to be a finished vehicle logistics provider of the future. And last but definitely not least, I'd like to welcome to the podium Brandon Mason, the Automotive Director and Mobility Leader from PwC. Brandon.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, my compliments to both Joshua and Sarah. I think those are some very good points that were made, particularly around the challenges that we have around next-gen mobility and autonomous vehicles, the need for public-private partnerships, and the need for infrastructure investment. And as I'm sure we all know, the environment that we live in today, there's a lot of balls in the air and a lot of uncertainty. And so how do you plan around all that uncertainty? And I think some good points were made around that. So I'm going to do my best to give our point of view around all these balls that are in the air, sort of where we see things going. And then I want to spend the latter part of my conversation talking about a survey that we recently published with the Manufacturing Institute around industrial mobility. So let us jump right into, and this chart is sales, U.S. sales. One of the big stories continues to be the breakout of segmentation between cars and light trucks. And the light truck share on the chart on the left is the red line, sort of ascending to unheard of heights, and then you've got passenger cars, which continue to decline. So at the end of this number's at the end of 2017. We finished the year at roughly 65% of the market were light trucks, and 36% of the market, 35% of the market was passenger cars. If you look at that year to date through February, it's gone even higher. We're at about 68% light trucks and 32% passenger cars. So this is a trend that is not changing. And then you see the breakout on the right within truck sales or light truck sales, that crossovers continue to be the rising star amongst segmentation. So if anybody was at any of the recent auto shows, whether that was Chicago or Detroit or even Geneva this past week, what you saw was a significant number of introductions that were in fact light trucks. So my estimate for Detroit was roughly about 80% of the products that were introduced were pickup trucks, SUVs, and crossover. We seem to have an insatiable demand for those types of vehicles right now. Again, no surprise given the state of the economy and relatively low fuel prices. So the question is, what would it take to sort of shift this back? Well, one of the things that we've been talking about is electric vehicles, more and more electric vehicles coming to market. That could sway it a little bit, unlikely to do so here in the US, but perhaps more globally. An increase in fuel prices could be another one. The question is, what price would it take to move that needle? And then lastly, any sort of recessionary trends that we see. But again, the economy appears to be in pretty good shape. We don't see that happening in the near term. So expect to continue to see more and more pickup, crossover, and SUV products introduced into the marketplace. So next is average transaction price, and this comes on the heels of what I just said, is that, hey, if we've got these bigger, more complex vehicles, transaction prices are going to continue to increase. And so these numbers are January and February respectively, but we're now above $35,000, give or take, average transaction price in the US. So even though we've had an interest rate hike already, and we've got a few more coming, which I'll talk about in a minute, it hasn't seemed to slow down the appetite for not only wanting larger, more complex vehicles, but the higher trim levels of those vehicles as well, with all the different bells and whistles that comes with it. So this is another trend that we wouldn't expect to see change, probably at least not towards the end of this year, there could be a point where interest rates increase to the point where that could start to level off those transaction prices. And then again, it would really take a fundamental shift back to passenger cars to have a decrease in average transaction prices. And here's the chart I was telling you about. So this is the Fed funds rate. And as it stands today, we're at 1.5%. So it actually has increased once this year. The Federal Open Market Committee estimates, they all give their estimates for what the rate hikes are going to be, the rates will be for 2018, 2019, 2020. So the median forecast for this year is that we'll end up somewhere around 2.1%. And so the Fed funds rate, for those of you that aren't familiar, hopefully most of the people are, that really sets the interest rates for a number of different things, for housing loans, for new vehicle loans, et cetera. So there is very much a trickle-down effect, and we've already just started to see a little bit of increase around both new and used vehicle interest rates. So 2.1% by the end of the year, rising to 2.7 in 2019 to 3.1% in 2020. Again, I think the idea here is you have to give yourself a little bit of buffer for the next recession that comes around, so we have an opportunity to lower the Fed funds rate. And you can see that it was essentially zero for a better part of the last decade coming out of the last Great Recession that we had. So this is going to have an impact on sales. We've already seen sales decline a little bit this year. We're still hovering above a 17 million unit SAAR for the first 2 months of the year, but sales are going to be down this year, just like they were last year. So you're starting to see an impact that these vehicles are getting a little bit more expensive, a little bit more prohibitive, and consumers are starting to pull back a little bit on the number of vehicles that they purchase. Next is vehicle imports, and this gets into the whole NAFTA discussion, and Sarah highlighted the impact of tariffs that were recently announced on steel and aluminum. So we'll get into that a little bit. This is our historical vehicle imports, U.S. vehicle imports by country. So last year, the U.S. imported 8.3 million vehicles into the country, and that's an all-time high and a 1.4% increase over 2016. Excuse me. And we've got a breakdown there of the major markets and how they fared. So I'll just quickly go through them. Mexico was the leader last year. 2.4 million vehicles were imported from Mexico. That represented a 12.3% increase year over year. Canada was next, 1.8 million units. They were actually down 8.1%. If you think about the assembly shifts going on in Canada, some plant closures, plant downtimes, et cetera, moving of products from Canada to the U.S. or Canada to Mexico, not a big surprise there either. Japan imported 1.7 million units. That was a 1.1% increase. That number will likely come down in subsequent years if you think about the recent investments that have been announced to locate facilities both in the U.S. and Mexico for the Japanese OEMs. South Korea, 900,000, down 7.1%. There's a lot of potential restructuring going around in South Korea right now. If you think about the small cars that are built there, as we talked about, mainly in the U.S., but also globally, there's waning demand for those small cars. Germany, 500,000, that's down 9.6%. Some of that has to do with the impact of luxury cars. Some of that, again, has to do with the localization of product in U.S. and Mexico. And then we have our other category, which is at 15.4%. So again, as we remain uncertain about what the outcome's going to be around NAFTA, one of the many things that we're sort of uncertain about from a policy and regulatory perspective, we sort of hold our breath. I mentioned at the conference in Mexico back in January that by our estimates, we've seen around 350,000 units that were previously allocated to Mexico, either existing volume or planned volume that has now shifted to the U.S. as OEMs begin to hedge their bets because of the uncertainty around NAFTA. That number could very well increase in the coming months and years as that uncertainty sort of plays out, or depending on what the end regulatory direction is given from NAFTA. So I want to talk a minute about the tariff announcement as well, because it's potentially significant, but as Sarah mentioned, it's hard to plan a business around something that could change at a moment's notice. So the summary is that starting next week, there is a 25% import on tariffs, 25% import on steel, and a 10% import tax on aluminum. And so Canada and Mexico are now exempt, and the language that the president gave was that there is great flexibility in this deal to countries that we consider to be friendly to us. So it's very much a negotiating tactic, right? If you play ball with us, maybe we'll add you to the exempt list, maybe we won't. Canada and Mexico, obviously this will probably play into the NAFTA discussions now. Canada and Mexico both rank in the top 5 in terms of importers of steel and aluminum. I actually think the bigger impact is on the aluminum side. If you look at the countries that are number 2 and number 3 in terms of the imports of aluminum, that's China and Russia. So I do think there's a significant impact there. In terms of what the impact is going to be on OEMs and suppliers and ultimately consumers, Wall Street is a little bit mixed on the reaction. Some think it's going to have a very profound impact on products, on their profitability. Others maybe not so much. There will be an impact, no doubt. But I think automakers and OEMs and suppliers are struggling with that as well to determine what's the impact going to be. Does that impact where we get our steel from, where we get our aluminum from, and how much of that cost can we pass on to the consumer? It seems unlikely that much of that cost would get passed on to the consumer just because you result in having an uncompetitive product from a price standpoint. And this is a very price-sensitive market, particularly in some of the segments that I mentioned around crossovers and SUVs and pickups. So again, this is very much, we hate to say it, but it's still very much a wait-and-see scenario where we're trying to see, what direction, which way is the wind blowing in terms of the policy standpoint. So one of those other things that we're still trying to scratch our heads and figure out. All right, so let's break it down from a sales and assembly outlook. So this is our U.S., Mexico, and Canada light vehicle sales forecast. As I mentioned last year, we finally had a year-over-year decline, the first time in 8 years that happened. We came in at 17.2 million units. This year, we're forecasting sales of 16.7 million units, flat for 2019, 16.7, and then a slight dip in both 2020 and 2021. We do see the market stabilizing somewhere between 16.5 and 17 million units. So again, year-over-year declines, sure, but still a very strong market. In Canada, I really think there's some significant downside, particularly in the out years. I mean, we do show a decline over the next several years in Canada. As I mentioned, some of that assembly being shifted away from that market and the potential economic impact of what NAFTA may have. So I do think the forecast for 2022 to 2024 is a little bit up in the air, but there is some downside to that forecast. And then Mexico, we still show going up considerably. I mean, we have a little bit of a decline forecasted this year, again, some of the uncertainty around NAFTA, but we do continue to see very strong investment in that. And it hasn't hindered, there's still 2 or 3 plants that are scheduled to come online in Mexico, so the economic investment there, the economic impact, still very strong. And the consensus GDP forecast for Mexico over the next 3 to 5 years remains very strong as well. So for those reasons, we continue to see a sales increase in Mexico. From an assembly standpoint now, if we switch to assembly, I talked about some of those OEMs hedging their bets and some of the announcements that have been made to move assembly out of Mexico or out of Canada into the U.S. And you now see sort of the end result of that, right? We show pretty strong assembly growth in the U.S. as a result of that. So last year, around 11.2 million units. By the end of our forecast window, we're at nearly 13 million units. So, I mean, you do the math, right? That's a lot of new capacity coming online within the U.S. As I mentioned, Canada, we see continued decline there as plants are contracted and potentially shuttered. And then Mexico, as I mentioned, we still see very strong growth there from an assembly standpoint, reaching 4.5 million units by the end of our forecast window. All right, so I want to shift gears a little bit now and talk a little bit about a recent survey that we conducted in conjunction with the Manufacturing Institute. This came out just last month to focus around industrial mobility. And so, we talked, Joshua and Sarah talked a little bit earlier about all of the challenges that come along with advanced mobility as it relates to passenger vehicles or personal mobility. And we agree with that, right? There's a lot of complexity involved in it. Do think on the industrial mobility side, and we sort of define industrial mobility as the movement of goods, raw materials, and finished products, and that's done through trucking, through shipping, through air, et cetera, that there are some opportunities to sort of accelerate the development in the industrial mobility space. So we focused on really 2 areas. One was inside the factory walls, so what are companies doing inside their factories? And the second part was the extended supply chain. And so what are we doing within the extended supply chain to impact that next-gen mobility? And then we sort of wrapped it up with a self-assessment study that folks could take. And this was done, and I believe there was 128 different large and mid-size companies that were involved in this study, in the survey. And so that was a mix of OEs and transportation providers as well. So I want to take you through some of the key findings through it. I know nobody likes to have too many statistics out there, and I don't want to confuse anybody, so we'll try and keep the stats and percentages to a minimum. But here are some of the key findings that came out of that study. The first was that 9% of manufacturers surveyed felt that they had 9% of manufacturers surveyed adopted some type of semi-autonomous or autonomous mobility within their operations, with another 11% expecting to do so over the next 3 years. And when we talk about semi-autonomous or autonomous within a factory, we know that there's already a high level of automation within those factories, right? But we're not talking about fixed robots or modes of transportation that are on fixed routes. We're talking about free-ranging robots, free-ranging modes of transportation that are driven by artificial intelligence. So while that number may seem low, if you think about the level of technology and complexity that we're talking about, it's actually quite impressive that you've got 9% that have already implemented that to some degree, and another 11% that are planning on doing so in the very near future. Second piece, so what are the top triggers for manufacturers to adopt this kind of technology? So again, mobile robots, autonomous trucks, et cetera. And people were allowed to give more than one answer, so don't worry if these numbers don't quite add up to 100%. There is some overlap. Cost advantage was obviously the largest response. So 86% of participants felt that the potential cost advantage to implement those technologies would drive them to do so. Next was customer supplier expectations. So again, how do you maximize the efficiency of your plant to increase output, et cetera. And the third most one was increased safety. Right? So workplace accidents and the like, how do you reduce those? In terms of the barriers to adoption for these technologies, cost was listed as the top barrier at 60% of response. Immature technology, again, a lot of these technologies are in their first generation, so it's difficult to spend that much money to justify the spend. If you're not sure what the ROI is going to be, it could be a longer ROI. There's a lot of glitches to work out, so you have to decide how much of an investment you're willing to take. Safety issues on the flip side of that, right? So, all right, could some of these actually cause workplace accidents? And then lastly was lack of talent, which we'll get to in a minute. So how many of these folks are actually trained to work alongside these robots or these technologies? How many people can service these robots or technologies? Now, if we flip to the extended supply chain here, the big area of focus that we focused on was autonomous trucking, right? So there are obviously opportunities across multiple spaces, but if you think about the amount of goods that are shipped using trucking versus other modes, it's not even close, right? So 90% of those surveyed believe that fully autonomous trucks could, when mainstreamed, save up to 25% of their total trucking costs. That's a big number, 25% savings. And 65% of respondents felt that autonomous trucking would be mainstreamed in the next 10 years. So again, if you look at the light vehicle side of that, we feel, probably 10 years at a minimum before you really hit the sweet spot and have the opportunity to mainstream light vehicle autonomous driving. Again, that's assuming you check all the boxes, some of which Sarah mentioned, the regulatory piece of it, the cost piece of it, the technology piece of it. So, there's definitely an opportunity on the autonomous trucking side to perhaps accelerate that. Because if you think about it, there is slightly less complexity around it. It's easier to integrate some of those costs of that technology into the vehicles. If you talk about things around geofencing, there's more set and dedicated routes. There's fewer variables to take into account, particularly if we're on a highway or a set route, even within a city. So there are more opportunities, we feel, on the autonomous trucking side compared to the light vehicle side. So those were some of the key findings. And just a little spotlight here. This is the potential savings around autonomous trucking. And so we built out really 3 different scenarios, and I'll walk you through them. The first was a week scenario, and this is the timeline there on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is the estimated cost savings that could be achieved. So in the weak adoption scenario, it assumes that rapid adoption doesn't begin until at least 2035, and a long-term level of 40% adoption by 2050. And that would achieve somewhere between 10 to 15% fully loaded cost savings. The baseline adoption, which is the one that I referenced earlier, that assumes adoption beginning in 2030, and that would achieve around 25% savings. You'd have mass adoption or long-term adoption of 60% by 2045. And then sort of the ideal scenario, the most the most optimistic scenario says that you're going to start to have rapid adoption in the next 5 to 10 years. So by 2025, increasing to 80% adoption by 2040, and that would achieve a 30% cost savings. You've seen a lot of these prototype models on the road right now. Several companies have introduced either semi-autonomous or fully autonomous trucks. So I think very much there's a wait-and-see attitude by the industry, and I'm sure everybody in here is keeping a watchful eye on that. Some of you are involved in those pilot programs. So it will be very interesting to see where we go forward from here. So lastly, we asked folks to take a self-assessment, and it's really 10 questions on the survey, but I'll give you a couple of the assessment questions that we asked here. The first was around building internal awareness. So, within your organization, do you have a designated role or roles assigned to developing and deploying the adoption of advanced industrial mobility? Some companies have very much invested in this technology. They've assigned different groups, different working groups. They've had very prominent senior executive roles dedicated just to this one topic. And there's no right or wrong answers here. It's just, where do you value that within your organization and what investments have you already made? The second is exploring business benefits. So have you worked with your logistics vendors and or your in-house logistics and transportation team to explore how autonomous freight transport could affect your business? And that's one thing that we've been helping our clients on, is to do that assessment to figure out what potential benefits or costs are associated with integrating those technologies. And lastly, from a workforce consideration, what are you doing to prepare your workforce to adopt industrial mobility within your operations to ensure safety and fully leverage the technology? I mentioned some of the safety stats or concerns around safety. Some of this is a shifting of the workforce too. There's an estimated 3.5 million truckers on the road right now. What does that look like if you hit 10, 20, 30% penetration for autonomous trucking? Some of those jobs might shift to truck drivers, from truck drivers to things like technicians or other technical roles to support the technology and work alongside it. So some thoughts, you can actually take a look at the full survey on pwc.com/mobility. Hopefully you'll find it of value. But those are all my prepared comments. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions during the panel discussion.
Thank you, Brendan. Well, thank you very much. I think there were 3 great thought-provoking presentations there. So now it's time for the Q&A. The usual kind of rules apply. If you've got any questions, please raise your hand. Wait for the microphone to come to you. Say your name and your company name. You can use the app. For those of you who have downloaded the app, you can use the app to ask a question. We've already had one question on the app. Priority will probably be given to those in the room, because it encourages better discussion and interaction. But if you prefer, you're more than welcome to post the question on the app. And also to my guys, because of the bright lights and the fact that I'm sitting down because I'm an old man, means I can't necessarily see so well in the corners where the bright lights are. So if you've got a question, you might help me by pointing out where the question is or something like that. So I will give you the opportunity if anyone wants to start with a question. And again, I will point out that in case you think if you don't ask any questions, you'll get to the coffee break quicker. I've got a whole bunch of questions here prepared, so don't think you're getting out any earlier.
I think you have one here.
But there's a question at the front here. Just wait for the microphone.
Hello, Bill Mangaluzzo, Journal of Commerce for Mason. Do you see most of the mobility, the autonomous mobility, happening within the production facility as opposed to over-the-road movement of vehicles?
Yeah, there are definitely very different types of mobility that we talk about when you talk about within the factory and then on road. I think in the factory autonomy has gotten a head start because of some of the things I talked about around fixed robotics and dedicated paths within the facility. And again, when you have a definable area like that, there's less complexity, less hurdles. So we do see in the near term more technology, more autonomous technology in the factory, to answer your question. But I do think longer term, there's a huge potential for the on-road technology to be integrated.
Yeah, I would add to that I think we need to be very mindful of the development of legal, ethical, and regulatory frameworks in that space as well. So I believe the technology will far precede the establishment of those frameworks. So for example, when you have an algorithm that's driving or moving the vehicle, in the event of the unexpected where you're going to have an accident, are you programming to save the owner's property? Are you programming it to avoid the proverbial bus of widows and orphans? So not only do you have to sort of come up with a regulatory context, but these are items that will take literally decades in our courts to establish a body of case law and for ethical frameworks to be built around that as well. So I think it's not as simple as when is the technology ready. I believe the technology for over-the-road autonomous vehicles, both on the light vehicle side and for class 6, 7, and 8 trucks, will far precede when we as a society are actually ready for that to happen. And imagine a scenario too where you have an accident or collision between an autonomous vehicle and an actual driver, right? Because the transition period and the turnover of the fleets and of the vehicles on the road, that's really the choppy waters. Because for a jury trial, to have an engineer testifying about how the technology would have acted or behaved in that accident versus a human being talking about how it affected potentially them or their family, we're still humans. So I think that those are the pieces that will be very difficult to predict how long it takes to develop.
Thank you. And Joshua, we understand that you need to have maybe smart cities first before you have the autonomous trucks, which is where you're kind of working on. But Carlos Ghosn, the CEO of Renault, Nissan, Mitsubishi, said recently that he believes that commercial vehicles will be the first adopters of autonomous vehicles. So are you looking at how you can fit autonomous commercial vehicles into LA and into your plan?
Well, from our perspective, it's hard for us to figure out what to do with autonomous commercial vehicles or what we can do. In theory, sure. We don't control the streets in Los Angeles County. I think what we can do, and what we are thinking about in terms of freight generally, is that we have a role to play in helping the freeways work more effectively, because they don't. And so that's why we're building a network of strategic managed lanes throughout the county that will allow people to bypass traffic if they're willing to pay for it. And I think that's something that logistics folks have often resisted, is the opportunity to pay more and necessarily reducing traffic. But we're going to look at that beyond just the managed lanes, thinking about what is the appropriate price to be charging to drive on this very valuable real estate. We're talking about some of the most valuable real estate in the world, and we just give away the road space for free. People can just drive on it for free, and they can park on it for a very low price. And that has to change if we're going to have better mobility in LA County.
Joshua, I like one of the things that you said too, and Sarah talked about it as well, is it's interesting if you had a clean slate, right, and you could just put all this next-gen technology into a city, never mind the existing infrastructure, you could do a lot of different things. But that's not the way that the world works, right? We have this infrastructure, particularly in LA, that's been around for a very, very long time. You've got aging, complex infrastructure that you have to work within and around. So it's not as simple as, I love the theoretical stuff, it's great. But when you put it down to practical application, it's incredibly difficult. So I think that's another point that often gets overlooked. So I'm glad that you brought it up earlier.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think what you're getting at is that innovation in government and in public policy is not really about technology at all. You saw a lot of the things that I mentioned aren't great technological advances. And I define innovation as things we haven't done before. It's not that no one's done it. It's not that it's a new technology. It's that we haven't done it. And there's a reason that we haven't done it. And the question is, what are the barriers to accomplishing that? And just because the technology is available, that's just one barrier. There's so many other public policy barriers in place that we have to deal with for any new thing. Those are where I come in.
Okay. Any questions from the audience? Question at the front, please.
Good morning. I am Govind Ranganath, and I am from an electric car startup in Silicon Valley. Our company is also working on autonomous vehicles, and especially Joshua, Sarah, and Brandon, great presentation to start with. I got one question for each of you. Joshua, I think you talked about shared mobility in Los Angeles, And I think some of the things that you mentioned that you're bringing back, like microbuses, things that have been tried before, but I think you're giving a new flavor to it. But he talks about infrastructure for autonomous vehicles. But if you look at in Silicon Valley, there are some companies that are already working on using autonomous vehicles with existing infrastructure. And I won't name some, but there are already some, and they are already running some of these. And especially people who are disabled, old, and also for young people, this is a great mode of transportation. It's like a shared. And also, these vehicles can be 24/7 on the street. Like, you don't have to rest the driver. So is that something you guys will be interested in the future in implementing it? Because I know San Francisco is going that way, and some of the major cities are looking already that way. And that's a question for you. And another question is for Sarah now. Sarah, I think a great presentation from Jack Cooper's standpoint. And Brandon presented some slides on savings of 25 to 30% on long-haul commercial trucking and stuff. Especially from Jack Cooper's standpoint, I think you said you were very progressive and you were planning to try this out and work it, and maybe you're already working with some autonomous technology already. And what's your confidence level in the next 10 years that you think some of it will be applied in your industry? And for Brandon, I think you mentioned regarding autonomous technology, we will not be one of the early adopters in US compared to China and Europe. And can you explain why? That's all. Thank you.
Well, I'll go first. So we, as I mentioned, we have an unsolicited proposal policy. We've received 102 unsolicited proposals from the private sector for new ideas. One of them was related to autonomous vehicles. So that's a pretty low number. I think that's primarily because the technology is not ready. But the one that was related to autonomous vehicles was related to an autonomous feature that we could potentially put on one of our buses that would have reduced incidents, improved safety. We looked at it and it did not make sense for us, but we'd be very excited about implementing any kind of autonomous measure on our vehicles that can improve safety, because we've got vehicles full of 40 to 60 people hurtling through the streets of Los Angeles at high speeds, and the safer we can make them, the better off we are in accomplishing our objectives. When it comes to a shared mobility of autonomous vehicle fleets roaming our streets, that's where I feel like we need to make some policy changes before that can really happen. First of all the things that Sarah already mentioned about the regulatory issues and making sure that we iron out who's at fault, those are big regulatory challenges, which we don't have as much to do with. But where we come into play, though, is what I mentioned earlier, that if we're still giving away the street space for free, and now it is way, way cheaper to have a vehicle roaming the streets 24 hours a day, what do you think is going to happen to mobility? So we have to change our mobility structure to accommodate whether it's autonomous vehicles or just more vehicles, which we're already getting anyway. We have to change how we charge for street space, how we allocate street space. We've got to have more street space dedicated to shared vehicles, buses, and less to single occupancy vehicles if we're going to be successful, whether the features are autonomous, electric, or anything else.
So for Jack Cooper's perspective, it's a great question. He asked about what are our plans for the near term for autonomous driver technology in our cabs. I think the issue for car haul companies is infinitely more complex than the average long-haul trucker, because our drivers are also loading and unloading the vehicles onto the rig. So I don't see that as being something that's fully automated, candidly, in my tenure at the company. And I'm not that old. So I think this is something that in the car haul space, we're really going to be looking at over the next 5 to 10 years as something that can drive us to zero safety incidents. This is really something that can make our drivers much safer. Potentially, I think for the long haul trucking sector, it's a little bit different. For them, this may be something that can help close the gap on a growing crisis in driver shortage. But again, we can only do that once we know what counts as hours of service. If you're in a vehicle, but you're sleeping in the cab as it's driving overnight on a highway, how does the regulatory framework evolve to count hours of service? So for me, in the next 2 to 5 years, we are explicitly and exclusively focused on driver assist technologies that can make the cars and trucks safer going down the road. We're also Teamster. So obviously we're going to need to negotiate with labor to understand how they play into this. But from my perspective, we have absolutely no desire to remove drivers from the cabs of our trucks now or over the next 5 to 10 years even. And again, I keep going back to the analogy of Sully, right? The autopilot function of that plane would not and could not possibly have predicted that landing on the Hudson was the safest way to make sure every individual on that plane survived. And I think there's still a human judgment piece that until we live in the deep learning era, which looks a lot like the Terminator movies for those of us who were children of the 80s, we're just not going to be removing drivers from the cab.
In terms of leadership around the development of autonomous vehicle technology, I think you look at it one of two ways, right? One is who is leading, as I said, in the development of that, and then another discussion is around to what extent will that be integrated in the markets that you talked about, so US, Europe, and China. So I mean, I think as we stand here today, the US is very much one of the leaders in development. And you're from Silicon Valley, so you know that more than most, right? All the exciting things that are going on up there. Part of this is a regulatory piece of it, and part of it is where we're at with the adoption of electric vehicles. If you're a believer that all autonomous vehicles need to be electric because of the integrated technology that needs to be involved on those architectures, we've probably got a little ways to go because our regulatory environment right now, you don't hear any talk in the US about banning of combustion engine vehicles. In fact, just the opposite, right? I mean, there's a good chance we're going to roll back the EPA standards for fuel efficiency. And again, in the slides I showed that talk about, over 2/3 of our market are pickups and crossovers and SUVs. So I do think you'll continue to see rollout of pilot programs, but in terms of the mass adoption of that technology, it seems likely that Europe and China, because of their respective regulatory environments, would be able to accelerate that into mainstream a little bit more quickly than the US. And again, you're one administration away from changing some of those rules, so it's hard to say, again, talking about all the uncertainty that we're trying to navigate through. But I do give credit to the industry because we're continuing to forge ahead, because we all know that's the future. We don't know exactly when, but we all agree it's important and investments need to be made today to make that future happen as quickly as possible.
Okay. Then there's a couple of questions over there.
Yes, Brian Mason with Pace Automotive. My question's for Sarah. And first, I do want to compliment all three of the presenters. Great presentation, so thank you very much for that. But Sarah, I'm really glad you touched on the human aspect of this, because as much as you mentioned this might be a potential solution to driver shortages, you've also, has Jack Cooper and has your company thought about, we basically created a whole new different, highly technical labor force that has to support and maintain and monitor this. And where is that labor force going to come from?
Absolutely. This is a great question. So from my perspective, this is actually something that will help us develop and entice, recruit the next generation of truck drivers. As most of you in the room know, it is very difficult to recruit drivers from our younger generations right now. We have an aging driver force. Jack Cooper, by the way, is no different than most of the rest of the trucking industry in that regard. And it is difficult. My pediatrician growing up actually paid her way through medical school driving a truck. It was a great paying job. It was a great way for her to pay for school. We would have a terrible time making that pitch, I think, today to a young student. And so my hope is that as those technologies become more advanced and more critical to the skilled labor trade that we have, that it actually becomes our best recruitment tool for new drivers.
Okay. Any more questions? Is there a question now?
Hi, Kevin Ryba. My question is for you, Sarah. You mentioned value added to, car haul, new car delivery. Do you have any examples of that we're not already doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we can look at everything on the more rote operational side. So are there incremental services for the dealerships or ways to make their lives easier? We can certainly look at things like PDI in terms of, is there a place for everybody to win where the carriers provide some of those services that have traditionally been done with perhaps higher cost labor at the dealer level, while still sharing enough of that revenue with the dealer to where it's net neutral for them from a profitability standpoint. So there's certainly the operational issues. Where I get more excited, though, is going down the technology path. So as an industry, we collect a large amount of data. We touch a large number of VINs. We see a large number of traffic patterns and interchanges and the interplay between various modes of transport. And up until this point, we've done virtually nothing with that. And so the idea of taking a machine learning approach to those data sets, to traffic patterns, to where the supply chain breaks down in a given month, given a certain number of weather events, for example, and to be able to overlay on those data sets predictive analytics to go back to a customer and say, not only here are the key performance indicators for our operations, but based on the data we've collected, we've run predictive analytics via machine learning for your supply chain coming out from what we see across carriers. I think that's the kind of value add that we need to be thinking about. So much more macro than even just the operational value added services piece.
Thank you. Any more questions? Okay, question right at the back. Right at the very back.
Sarah, that's good, thinking about the human part of it. But Josh, I have a question. Joshua, free parking on the streets and driving, that's what I don't understand. When the transit system's only getting about 20% return, it's not like to me the taxpayers, we aren't riding and parking free. Could you explain that?
I'm not sure what you mean about parking. Can you explain what you're asking about parking?
You said using of the roads are free, and all that needs to be changed. Nothing's free for me, but riding a bus would be.
Well, yeah, so the way we allocate road space currently in Los Angeles County and most of the country is first come, first serve, right? Which is unusual because typically when you have a limited resource, you want to allocate it more reasonably than that. You want to allocate it based on efficiency, right? And you wouldn't have a limited resource in any other context and say whoever gets here first gets it. It's like the Soviet bread lines. I mean, they gave away bread for free in the Soviet Union. You had a line. That's why we have traffic. We give away the road space for free. Now, you say, well, you pay. Yeah, you buy a car, you buy gas. There's all kinds of things you do have to pay for, and you do pay some taxes that go towards maintaining those roads, but you're not paying for the use of that road at that time. And parking, if you look at how parking is given out in Los Angeles County, there are parking minimums for every development. So we have to build a certain amount of parking for everything that we build, which creates an excess amount of parking, and in fact lowers the cost of parking, which encourages more driving. When it comes to public transportation, there are tremendous societal benefits for every person who's using public transportation. It creates benefits. It creates benefits by reducing the number of vehicles on the road. It creates benefits by reducing emissions. It creates benefits by allowing more concentration of people in a smaller space, which creates economic growth. So the fact that people aren't able to pay for the full cost of public transit because the average income of a person on our system is $19,000 a year, to me, does not seem all that important. The question is, what are the benefits that we are providing, and are they worth the cost? And I would argue that they are worth the cost, but that we will have much greater benefit from a public transit system when the roads and the drivers are paying their fair share.
Okay. And a question that came through for you, Joshua, from the app is how is Metro interfacing with the Boring Company to create hyperspeed transit, and is it for real?
I would say we're interfacing with them in the sense that they've talked to us about submitting an unsolicited proposal. They think that they perhaps can improve upon the tunneling technology we have. If they can, that would be wonderful. I think that a Boring Company is a great example of why technology does not solve public policy problems. The public policy problem in Los Angeles as I've articulated several times, is that we have not enough space allocated to mass transit vehicles, to shared vehicles, and too much to single occupancy vehicles. And what we're trying to solve that problem with is by building more right-of-way for rail. Building more right-of-way for rail is very complicated and challenging, and it is not because of technology. It is because you have to get the right-of-way from people who currently live near it or own it. And they aren't pleased about giving their right-of-way over to a mass transportation vehicle. And they're going to resist it, they're going to sue you, there's going to be an environmental impact process. The whole thing takes a really long time and a tremendous amount of effort. And it doesn't matter what the technology is that you're putting in that tunnel or that above-ground right-of-way, that effort still remains. So that's why there's a lot of public sector people who are skeptical about the boring company, not because the technology couldn't work, not because it isn't a good idea, it's because technology doesn't solve the problem we have, which is that there is an extremely litigious society that we live in, and that there are people who are going to resist any change in their urban environment, and that that's going to make acquisition of right-of-way difficult.
Okay, thank you. And before we finish, just maybe one more red and green card question. We talked earlier, or Sarah highlighted earlier, that one of the issues with equipment is that you're buying equipment now that could potentially last 10 or 20 years. So how do you buy at this moment in time? If how do you invest next for your trucking, bearing in mind that hopefully it's going to be still going for 10 or 20 years? So I think the first question is, how many of you are expecting your next truck buy to be an electric vehicle, an electric truck? So again, if you use the red and green cards, green if you think you expect your next buy to be an electric truck, and red if you don't expect it to be an electric truck.
Wow.
Okay, well I think that's pretty clear. For those of you who can't see, it's very much red. Definitely expecting not to be. So I don't think I'm even going to ask about who's expecting to be an autonomous truck. I think we're miles away from that. But it is interesting, bearing in mind how things are going to change, what the environmental issues and so on. That the next vehicle, which is expected to last for 10 years, isn't expected to be electric. Just an interesting stat, really. But otherwise, I think we've overrun a little bit, but I think it was very interesting, great presentations and some good questions. So thank you very much to the panel. The next sessions we'll be splitting in two. So in this room will be the connected collaborative network, and in room B will be the resilient supply chain. So you might want to take your bags and things with you as we're changing over, but please join us for a coffee break and refreshments hosted by Driver.
In the sky.